Good morning. I'm really excited to be here. I am in the middle of my fourth book, and it has a lot of water in it, and I'm pretty sure that's why I was invited. This is turning out to be the hardest book I've ever written. It's about how everything is connected, and so figuring out how to organize it is a challenge. It's probably almost certainly going to be the most controversial book I've written. And so the creative part of this creative morning is I'm going to invite you to taste the cookie dough before it's been baked. I've never actually shared the ideas from a book before it was finished before, and so I'm excited to get feedback, which is why you have these forms on your chair. I really would love to hear what resonates. If you want to talk about what doesn't resonate, there's extra room on the back. And I have some copies of my last book in the back at the end for the first 20 people who fill out a form, just as a little incentive. Before I explain the concept of the book, let me just say a little bit about myself. I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment a few blocks off City Avenue. And nature was my escape. From a very early age, this is my favorite body of water, the Wissahickon Creek. Anybody fans of the Wissahickon? Yeah. My mom started bringing me here when I was 5 with my friend Mary, and in hindsight, she let us run around by ourselves at an alarmingly young age, before helicopter parenting. But it really instilled this deep love, both of nature in general and the woods, but particularly of bodies of water. And when I look back over my life, that draw to water has played a huge role in my spiritual life, in my mental health. I still walk in the Wissahickon. And as a teenager, I actually was, this is a little funny, Girl Scout of the Year of Philadelphia, because that was one of my main avenues for escape, learning to canoe and all that kind of stuff. So shout out to the local waterways. Over time, my understanding of love of the land started to change and started to integrate more with the concerns I had about justice. And especially coming out of Hurricane Katrina, realizing I had known about climate change since 1989, but realizing how climate change was going to intersect with racial and economic disparities, that was a big wake-up call, and part of what fueled me to become a climate activist. So this is a picture of the group I work with in Philly, Earthquaker Action Team. Our first campaign was getting PNC Bank to stop financing mountaintop removal coal mining. And we did that by using nonviolent direct action to pressure this corporation to live up to its own green hype. We're now pressuring PECO, our local utility, to help facilitate a Green New Deal in this region. And so the book that I'm writing comes out of that experience as an activist of wanting to write a book that will serve this moment as more people are waking up to climate change, as kids are striking school, as the US Congress is finally starting to talk about it. And people are starting to talk about how to integrate the solutions to climate change with problems of economic and racial inequality in our country and in our world. So the idea for the book was inspired by some words that came to me. I was at an event where people were asked to name their vision, and the words that came said, "It's not about us saving the earth. The earth will survive whether we do or not. But the crisis of the earth is saving us from our illusion of separation." So your first job as an audience is to think about that line for a moment. The crisis of the earth is saving us from our illusion of separation. I would love to hear, what do you think that means? What comes up for you when you hear that, the illusion of separation? Any volunteers? Interconnectedness of all living beings. Great. Anybody else? Dust to dust. You mean the life cycle? Yeah. Great. That human beings feel they operate outside of other life forms, the systems of life. One or two more. Our actions have consequences. Yes.
How our illusion that us being here in this place and time, what we do doesn't affect somebody else very far away, and that conversely, what they're experiencing does not affect us. It does.
That's right. So there's our connection with nature, with all living beings, and particularly with other human beings. So we don't see the way our actions affect other people. Absolutely. And it's part of the challenge of this book is the more I go into it, the more I think everything is connected to the illusion of separation. And I have like so many notes. It's crazy. So what I'm going to do is just share a few stories. Starting with this part about how do we relate to the natural world. I mentioned that for me, the Wissahickon was an escape. And I've started to realize that that is part of the way that I have seen the places that I go on vacation is escape from email, right? Escape from daily life. Instead of really thinking about the water that comes out of my tap or the water in the Queen Lane reservoir, which I actually need to live, This is a well-worn argument, and one of my dilemmas is how much to go over it, but I'll just give a little taste today. This picture is from a lake in the Adirondacks, which is one of my very favorite escapes. It's so remote that you have to drive on a dirt road for 45 minutes, get in a kayak across a lake, and go through this little tunnel to get to another lake that has no buildings on it. Yes, I want to go there right now. I feel the same way. The last time I was there, I found out that there's a Cornell scientist who's been studying fish at a neighboring lake that's just as remote. And he told me that he can tell in the life of the fish when the Clean Air Act was passed. Not even the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. And he can tell when the amendments were passed to the Clean Air Act. Because that impacted what people could release from factories in the Midwest. And what they do in Detroit actually affects the fish in these lakes in the Adirondacks, even though this is a protected space. Another example that blew my mind, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, was many times bigger than the Exxon Valdez spill. They found in the following year that 80% of the pelicans in Minnesota had chemicals associated with the spill. And the cleanup of the spill where they used chemicals that were actually just as bad as the oil, right, for the cleanup. So 80% of the pelicans in Minnesota, or the pelican eggs the following year. There was also a study estimating that sea turtles would carry a tremendous number of toxins to the coast of Africa as a result of the BP spill. So that's one level of it, right? Another level of the illusion of separation is thinking about this question of how we conceive of nature. And the Adirondacks particularly interest me because they became this semi-protected space. They have a special legal status. But I had always heard that there had been issues before that. And what I found out was that the Hudson River, this is the very top of the Hudson. I went looking for it. This is where Hudson appears on the map. The Hudson River was a key part, of course, of the development of our economy. Before the industrial economy, the Abenaki and the Mohawk and the Mohican and the Lenape traded along the Hudson. And so that became a major, lifeblood of the industrial economy. A huge percentage of the Adirondacks were actually deforested in the 19th century. And they would drag them across the ice, the logs, put them on the Hudson River when it was frozen, and then wait for the ice to melt. And that was how they shipped logs downstream. So this was wood that helped build railroad ties. A lot of the bark was used in the tanning industry that was centered in New York City. New York City was the center of the leather trade. And so they would take bark from the hemlocks in the Adirondacks, bring it down, create leather, and then dump the toxins in the East River. So it's all of a system, right? Our economy is all connected too. When I first started thinking about how the Hudson was connected, and this is a view from Manhattan, the first connection I thought of was that many of the people who fought for the protection of the Adirondacks were rich white men who wanted to hunt and fish there, right? They were the people getting rich off the industrial economy in places like New York. But then I learned something that I thought was really interesting. Part of the reason they protected the Adirondacks is they realized that all that deforestation up north was causing silt to fill up the upper Hudson, and it was screwing up trade in the lower Hudson. So there was this recognition of the interconnectedness that they couldn't actually keep trading in the lower Hudson unless they fixed the problem in the upper Hudson. Now, another idea that other people have written about is how the industrial economy separated the land we take stuff from, the land we make things on, the land we dump things in, and the land where people live. My Druid Irish ancestors didn't think of the land that way, and neither did most indigenous people. So one of the dilemmas in the book is how much to go into that, how much to go into the philosophy of how people look at the land. What's clear to me is that the separation between human beings and the land is deeply intertwined with the ways we're separated from each other. Having communities that, frankly, politicians don't care about makes it easier to find places to dump the junk that is produced by this system. And most people don't get the chance to go to the Adirondacks. Most people relate to the land in their backyard. This is a picture from the Houston Ship Canal, where I found people fishing 2 weeks after Hurricane Harvey, which had released a lot of toxins into the whole area. This is an aerial view of the Houston Ship Channel. One of the things we need to grapple with is that many industries, especially our most toxic industries like the petrochemical industries, want to be on rivers. You know, sometimes they use the water for cooling, but they often use it for trade. And so a lot of toxic facilities are on rivers, which are becoming increasingly flood prone with climate change. So think that through a minute. It's also true that lower income communities, and particularly lower income communities of color, are more likely to live in those neighborhoods. In Houston, I visited an immigrant community of mostly Latino people who lived right next door to this stuff. There was one house where if your kid threw a ball over the fence, they would hit one of these chemical drums because there's no zoning in Houston. And that is an extreme case of it, but it's the reality all over the world, that some people are bearing the highest risk of this arrangement. An activist from New York City told me once that if Hurricane Sandy had come in at a slightly different angle, all the toxic waste of New York would have been released because of the same dynamic. It tends to be waterfront. It tends to be, you know, north of Staten Island, Brooklyn's Red Hook neighborhood. And so every day there are communities living with this risk, even before we get the big flood events. This is a picture from Louisiana, which just captured the irony of the whole thing for me. Louisiana has become really special to me in the last year. When I started this book, my plan was that when people invited me to speak, I would just go research wherever I was because there's problems everywhere. And that's how I first came to Louisiana. I was speaking in Texas. Oh, it didn't seem that far. But Louisiana is taking over the book because the problems they have are the same problems that we have, but they're very stark. Hurricane Katrina, as I mentioned, was a very stark example of the risk of increased hurricanes from climate change. And it was a stark example of how income inequality affects who is hit the hardest. As the environmental justice movement has grown up, that argument has become a lot clearer. I'm just curious from this audience, how many people have thought about that already, that the worst environmental impacts are unequal? Okay, awesome, great. It's true around the world, it's true of climate change, and it's true of toxic pollution. One of the problems that I see, and part of what the book wants to address, is that we're all connected and the effects are unequal. Those two conversations end up happening separately. And I'm interested in how can we say both of those things at once? How can we acknowledge that we all drink the same water ultimately and acknowledge that there's a huge gap? So in Pennsylvania, for example, has the highest gap in air quality between white and black communities of any state in the US. And that air moves. Both are true. Part of the reason that I keep being drawn back to Louisiana is it's so crystal clear there how this relates to history. I think it's related to history everywhere. But in Louisiana, there's just no question. Anyone have a guess of what this is a map of? This is a 19th century map of the part of the lower Mississippi. Any guess what the yellow and green are? Farm versus industry, great guess. It was 19th century, so they were actually farms. They were plantations that enslaved people to grow sugar cane. And the plantations were marked out in these strips so that everybody could have a piece of the waterfront, because you needed the waterfront for trade, right? This is just a small segment. It's north of New Orleans and south of Baton Rouge. And what happened historically was that at the end of the Civil War, many African Americans who had been enslaved left. North of here, there's a town called Freetown that people established. But many also stayed and continued working the same sugarcane fields. And so what the plantation owners did was they gave those African American families strips of land between the plantations, kind of along the lines. And what happened over the 20th century is that many of those strips of land got sold to industry. And so the situation is 150 petrochemical plants in this area, with African American communities living right in between them. The way the land is passed down in Louisiana is tied to the Napoleonic Code, so you have to like prove title back through the generation to sell your property. So there's this added burden on African Americans who want to move away from these areas. I'll just give you one concrete example. This is a plant called Denka. It used to be owned by DuPont. It's on that same stretch that was in the last slide. And the Denka plant creates neoprene. It's now the only place in the United States which is part of the process of creating rubber. And for some reason, well, there's chloroprene and neoprene are created in the process. For some reason, chloroprene is not regulated. The EPA has a suggested guideline, but there's no enforcement of it. And the suggested guideline is a fraction, a small fraction of what they actually release. So you can see here the risk per million individuals by census tract to get cancer. And the darkest area that is closest to the plant is an African American community. Those folks have organized, they're vocal, they're outspoken, they are lobbying the EPA to try and have stricter regulations. They've tried to pressure the company. And part of what has struck me so hard is how the white people in the extended area are completely clueless. Because look they have a higher risk of cancer too. Louisiana actually has the second highest cancer rates in the United States across the board. But a lot of the white folks are Trump voters who have bought the argument that this doesn't affect them. And so there's been this perverse, I think, effect of the environmental justice argument of emphasizing how this affects black and brown people and losing the other truth that ultimately you do breathe the same air. Your rate of cancer is a little lower, but like, is that really a privilege that you want to fight for, a slightly lower cancer rate? So I've been interviewing activists, hearing inspiring stories of people coming together across difference and fulfilling what I think is another message of that phrase, the crisis of the earth is healing us from our illusion of separation. I don't think our movement has it together yet, but we are starting to find ways to acknowledge both our common interests and the differences between us and the injustice so that we can work together to address these problems. This is a picture from Philadelphia from a rally. We certainly have those issues here in our region as well. And climate change is frankly going to make them all worse. This was, I was in Louisiana 2 weeks ago. This was how high the Mississippi was 2 weeks ago. So the fact that climate change is increasing the risk of flooding is bringing to the fore these problems, which is scary and a little depressing. But what's exciting for me is watching the awareness grow. And so my question that I would love help with is figuring out how to write a book that will help this process as much as possible. I think I'll pause there and take a couple of questions.